I was 31 years old when I finally understood that in my family, responsibility wasn't a compliment. It was a life sentence. For most of my life, I believed being the reliable one meant I was loved more, trusted more, protected more. I believed families rewarded stability. I believed if you showed up, paid your bills, stayed calm, and never became a problem, you earned safety. I was wrong. In my family, responsibility didn't shield you. It marked you. It meant you were the one everyone leaned on when things went wrong. The one expected to absorb pressure so no one else had to feel it. I didn't know that lesson had already been decided for me until a quiet Sunday dinner turned into a verdict. No raised voices. No warning. Just a casual announcement. A few approving nods. And a future reassigned without my consent. My sister quit her job without warning. My parents smiled and said it was only natural. And somewhere between the sound of silverware and my father clearing his throat, my role in the family quietly changed forever. They didn't ask if I agreed. They told me what I was going to do. That was the night I learned the truth. In my family, love didn't mean care. It meant compliance. My name is Erin Wallace. And at the time, I was 31 years old, living alone in a small apartment I paid for myself. Working as a magazine editor in the city, my life was predictable in the best way. Deadlines, morning coffee, a steady paycheck, quiet evenings. I had built it carefully, brick by brick, because no one else was ever going to do it for me. Growing up, I learned early which role belonged to me. I was the one who didn't cry too loudly, the one who figured things out, the one my parents described as so mature for her age. My older sister, Lauren, was different. She was sensitive, emotional, someone who needed extra understanding. When I struggled, I was told it would make me stronger. When Lauren struggled, the world stopped to accommodate her. As adults, nothing really changed. I worked through college, took on internships, paid off loans, and moved out as soon as I could afford it. Lauren moved back home more than once. She drifted from job to job, always leaving for reasons that sounded serious enough not to question. Stress, burnout, a bad environment. My parents never pushed. They worried instead. I told myself this was balance, that families worked like that. Someone had to be steady so someone else could fall apart. That Sunday night started like so many others. A familiar dinner, the same table, the same routine. My parents looked relaxed, almost relieved to have us all together. Lauren seemed lighter than usual, like she was carrying good news she couldn't wait to share. Halfway through the meal, she put her fork down and said it casually, like she was commenting on the weather. She told us she had quit her job. No notice. No backup plan. She said she couldn't do it anymore and needed time to focus on herself. I remember waiting for the pause that never came, waiting for my parents to ask what she planned to do next, waiting for concern. Instead, my mother smiled and reached for Lauren's hand. My father nodded thoughtfully, as if this made perfect sense. They said it was probably for the best. That mental health came first. That sometimes you just had to listen to your body. I felt something tighten in my chest. But I stayed quiet. I always stayed quiet. Then my father turned to me. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't sound angry. He sounded practical. He said that while Lauren figured things out, we would all need to support her. He said it like it was a shared responsibility. But his eyes settled on me. My mother followed, her tone gentle but decisive. She said I was stable, responsible, established. She said I understood how the world worked. She said this wouldn't be forever, just until Lauren got back on her feet. No one asked me if I could. No one asked me if I wanted to. They spoke as if the decision had already been made. Because it had. Not by Lauren. By them. I looked at my sister. She didn't look guilty. She looked relieved. Comfortable. Like someone who had just handed off a burden she no longer wanted to carry. I wanted to say something. I wanted to ask questions. I wanted to understand what support meant and where the line was. But the conversation moved on before I could find my voice. They talked about timing, about how stressful life had become, about how lucky Lauren was to have a family who cared. I nodded when they looked at me. I always did. Driving home that night, the city lights blurred through my windshield. I told myself I was overreacting, that this was temporary, that families helped each other. I had spent my whole life believing that being dependable was the same thing as being valued, but somewhere deep down, beneath the rationalizations and the habits I'd built over decades, a quiet realization began to form. This wasn't help. It was expectation. And for the first time, I understood something that scared me more than the argument we hadn't even had yet. If I didn't comply, I wouldn't just disappoint them. I would become the problem. I didn't know it then. But that dinner wasn't the beginning of a request. It was the beginning of a demand. The morning after that dinner, I woke up with the uneasy feeling that something had been said out loud before my mind was ready to hear it. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet I usually loved. But that morning it felt thin, like it could tear if I touched it too hard. I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying my father's calm voice, my mother's reassuring smile, the way Lauren hadn't looked surprised at all. I told myself I was overthinking it, that my parents would call later and clarify, that they'd say they hadn't meant it the way it sounded. Families said things impulsively sometimes. Surely no one expected me to just absorb another adult's life. I went to work anyway. Deadlines didn't care about family drama, and neither did the editor-in-chief. By mid-morning, I was editing a feature piece, highlighting sentences, doing what I'd done for years without thinking. My phone buzzed once. Then again. I ignored it until lunch, when the screen finally lit up with my mother's name. Her voice was soft when I answered, almost cheerful. She asked if I'd slept well, if work was busy, if I'd eaten. Then, as smoothly as if she were changing the subject, she brought up Lauren. She said she was worried about her. She said quitting like that had taken courage. She said we just needed to help her get through this phase. It's only temporary, she said. Like that explained everything. You know that. I waited for the part where she asked me what I thought. It never came. Instead, she talked about how stable my life was, how proud she was of me, how lucky Lauren was to have a sister who understood responsibility. She said it the way people say a compliment, but it landed like a conclusion she'd already reached. I didn't agree. I didn't refuse either. I said I needed to think about it, and she sounded relieved, as if that were the same thing as a yes. Lauren called that evening. Her tone was different from my mother's. Confident. Casual. She didn't ask how I was doing. She jumped straight into telling me how exhausted she'd been at her job, how freeing it felt to finally step away. She talked about her days as if she were already on vacation, listing errands, lunches with friends, classes she might take someday. Then she started mentioning money. Not in numbers, in assumptions. She said she'd need help covering a few things while she got settled. Rent, groceries, the basics. She said it like we both understood what that meant, like it had already been agreed upon. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice neutral. I asked what her plan was. She laughed lightly and said that was exactly why she needed time. She said I of all people should get that. By the time we hung up, I felt like I'd been slowly pushed a few steps closer to a line I couldn't see yet. Over the next few days, the language shifted. What had been framed as help started sounding like expectation. Lauren stopped explaining and started stating. My parents stopped reassuring and started reminding. They talked about family loyalty, about sacrifice, about how much they'd done for me over the years. Whenever I asked practical questions, the mood changed. If I asked how long this would last, my mother said I was stressing Lauren out. If I asked why my parents couldn't cover her expenses, my father said I was missing the point. Family didn't nickel and dime each other, he said. Family stepped up. What I noticed was what they didn't say. No timeline, no limits, no plan for Lauren to return to work. Just a vague sense that I was expected to make space, financially and emotionally, for as long as necessary. One night, After another circular phone call, I sat at my kitchen table and tried to make sense of the numbers myself. My income, my rent, my savings. I could help. Technically, I always could. That had been the problem my whole life. My ability to cope had always been treated as permission. A thought crept in that made me uncomfortable. If I said no, I wouldn't just be setting a boundary. I would be breaking an unspoken agreement that had existed since childhood. The agreement that I would be the one who didn't make things harder. A few days later, my father stopped by my apartment unexpectedly. He didn't stay long. He didn't sit down. He stood near the door, hands in his pockets, talking about how worried he was about Lauren, how fragile she was right now. He said it would devastate her to feel abandoned by her own sister. He told me this wasn't about money. It was about character. After he left, I stood in my hallway for a long time, staring at the closed door. Something about the visit felt rehearsed. The timing, the talking points, like they were all working from the same script. That was when I started noticing other things. How my parents had been oddly evasive when finances came up. How my mother deflected whenever I asked how they were managing things themselves. How quickly the conversation shifted away from specifics. It didn't make sense. My parents had always been careful, conservative, proud of being responsible. If Lauren needed help, why did it all seem to funnel back to me? Lauren texted me that night, saying she was making a big decision soon and needed me on her side. She added a smiley face. As if that softened the implication, I stared at the message longer than I should have. For the first time, the word temporary felt meaningless. It wasn't a timeline. It was a tactic. Something people said when they wanted you to stop asking questions. I didn't respond right away. I told myself I needed clarity before committing to anything. But beneath that, another realization was taking shape. Quieter but heavier. This wasn't about helping my sister through a rough patch. It was about shifting responsibility permanently, one small step at a time. And whatever Lauren was about to ask next, I knew it wouldn't be small. Lauren called me early the next morning. Earlier than she ever had when she was working. I knew something was different the moment I heard her voice. It wasn't tired or uncertain. It was focused, almost brisk, like she was checking something off a list. She didn't ask how I was. She said she had made a decision she felt really good about and needed to talk to me right away. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone pressed to my ear, already feeling that familiar pressure build behind my ribs. She told me she'd found a solution that would make everything easier. She said it would give her freedom to reset her life properly, without constantly worrying about money or logistics. She said this was the kind of step people took when they were serious about their future. Then she said she needed me to sign something. At first, she was vague. She talked around it, using words like paperwork and formality. When I pressed her, she finally said it outright. She needed me to co-sign a loan. Not a small one. Something substantial. She explained that without income, lenders wouldn't take her seriously. But with my credit and stability, it would be simple. Almost automatic. I felt a cold drop in my stomach. I asked what the loan was for, even though I already suspected the answer. She said it was an investment in herself, a necessary step to maintain her independence while she figured things out. She said it like it was obvious I would understand. I told her I needed details. Amount, length, repayment plan. There was a pause, just long enough to register irritation. She said we didn't need to get bogged down in numbers. She said it was temporary. She said my parents were on board and thought it made sense. By the time we hung up, I felt like I'd been handed something fragile and dangerous without being allowed to look at it properly. That evening, my parents invited me over to talk. They were already seated when I arrived, Lauren between them, looking calm and expectant. The paperwork was on the coffee table, neatly stacked, like it had been waiting for me. My father spoke first. He said this was a practical solution. He said families work together. He said my sister needed support, not skepticism. My mother added that this wasn't really about money. It was about trust. She said I was good with details, and would make sure everything was handled responsibly. I realized then that they had rehearsed this. I picked up the papers and skimmed them. The numbers weren't outrageous, but they weren't trivial either. This wasn't a favor. It was a commitment that could follow me for years. I asked again how Lauren planned to pay it back if she wasn't working. Lauren's expression tightened. She said I was focusing on the wrong thing. She said the loan was what would give her space to heal, to find the right path. She said once she was in a better place, everything would fall into place. I looked at my parents, waiting for them to acknowledge the risk. They didn't. My father said I was being overly cautious. My mother said I was letting anxiety control me. They both reminded me how much they had sacrificed for me growing up. How lucky I was to have the life I did. The room felt smaller with every sentence. I realized something unsettling as they talked. This decision had already been made. The papers weren't there for discussion. They were there for my signature. My role wasn't to evaluate or agree. It was to comply. Lauren slid the documents closer to me and handed me a pen. She smiled. The same smile she used when she knew she was about to get her way. She said we could take care of it quickly so we could all move forward. That was the moment the line became visible. I set the pen down. I said no. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone. I said I wasn't comfortable signing something that put me legally responsible for a debt I didn't understand and couldn't control. I said I loved my sister. But this crossed a boundary. The reaction was immediate. Lauren stared at me like I'd slapped her. My mother's face hardened. The softness gone. My father's jaw tightened. He said I was being selfish. He said I was turning my back on my own family when they needed me most. Lauren's voice rose, sharp and incredulous. She asked how I could do this to her. She said I knew how fragile she was right now. She said I had everything and she had nothing. I told her she had choices. That quitting her job had been one of them. That signing this loan would make me responsible for consequences I hadn't agreed to. My hands were shaking. But my voice didn't. That only made things worse. My mother said I was acting cold. My father said he was disappointed in me. He said this wasn't how he raised me. The words hit harder than I expected. Because they were true. This wasn't how they raised me. They raised me to say yes. Lauren pushed the papers back toward me again. Harder this time. She said I was overreacting. She said everyone expected me to help. She said I would regret this if I didn't. Something in her tone made my skin prickle. It wasn't desperation anymore. It was certainty. Like she knew the consequences would fall on me either way. I stood up. I said I wasn't signing anything. Now or later. I said this conversation was over. My father stood too, anger flashing across his face. He said if I walked away from this, I would be choosing selfishness over family. I looked at all three of them and saw, with sudden clarity, that love in this room had conditions I could no longer meet. I left without the papers. I left without another word. Driving home, my heart pounded. But beneath the fear was something else. Relief. I had said no. Quietly. Clearly. Without apology. I didn't know yet what it would cost me. But I knew one thing for certain. I had stopped being useful. And that, in my family, was unforgivable. For 2 days after I refused to sign the loan, there was nothing, no calls, no messages, no dramatic confrontations. The silence almost convinced me that maybe, just maybe, they had accepted my answer. It was a familiar mistake. The first call came from my mother on the third morning. Her voice was calm but strained, like she was holding something fragile together with sheer willpower. She told me she was disappointed. Not angry. Just hurt. She said Lauren hadn't slept, that she was crying constantly, that my refusal had shaken her sense of security. She asked how I could live with myself knowing I'd caused that kind of pain. I reminded her, gently, that I hadn't caused anything. I had simply said no. The word seemed to offend her more than any accusation ever could. Later that day, my father called. His approach was different. He didn't talk about feelings. He talked about duty. He said families survived because people did what needed to be done, not what felt comfortable. He said I was acting like a stranger, like someone who didn't understand loyalty. He warned me that choices had consequences, and I should think carefully about the path I was taking. By the end of the week, the narrative had fully shifted. I wasn't someone setting a boundary anymore. I was someone betraying the family. That's when the messages from other people started. An aunt I rarely spoke to texted me about how worried my parents were. A cousin sent a long message about sticking together during hard times. Even a family friend I hadn't seen in years reached out to remind me that blood was thicker than money. Each message repeated the same points in slightly different words, as if they were all reading from the same outline. I stopped responding. The pressure didn't ease. It escalated. On Friday afternoon, I was leaving a meeting when I saw Lauren standing near the reception desk at my office. She looked polished, put together, nothing like the fragile figure my parents had been describing. She smiled when she saw me, wide and practiced, like this was a coincidence instead of a calculated move. "I just wanted to talk," she said, loud enough for the receptionist to hear. "I've been so worried about you." I felt heat rush to my face. My workplace was the one place my family had never touched. And suddenly she was standing there, wearing concern like a costume. I told her quietly that this wasn't the place. She followed me anyway, matching my steps down the hallway, talking about misunderstandings and how things had gotten blown out of proportion. I could feel eyes on us. Curious, alert. In the elevator, she turned sharper. She said I was embarrassing her. She said people were starting to ask questions. She said I was making things harder than they needed to be. I told her to stop. I told her to leave. When she didn't, I said the word security. And for the first time, she hesitated. Her smile disappeared. She hissed that I was heartless, that I'd always been jealous of how much our parents cared about her, that if anything happened to the family, it would be on me. I walked away without responding. That night, I blocked their numbers. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't done in anger. It was quiet, almost surgical. One by one, I removed their access to me. The constant buzz of my phone stopped, and the silence that followed felt different this time. Heavier. Final. For a few days, I grieved. Not for the people they were showing themselves to be, but for the family I had believed I was part of. I thought about holidays, childhood memories, inside jokes that suddenly felt like artifacts from another life. I wondered if I was being cruel, if I was proving them right. Then another message came through, from a number I didn't recognize. It was Lauren. She told me I couldn't just disappear. She said I was being dramatic. She said if I thought this would all go away, I was naive. She reminded me that families didn't forgive abandonment easily. There was something different in her tone now. Less outrage, more calculation. She said I should reconsider before things got worse. She said she was trying to protect me. That was the moment it clicked. This wasn't about reconciliation. It wasn't about feelings. It was about control. They weren't angry that I had said no. They were angry that I had stopped responding to pressure. I didn't reply. The next morning, I changed my routine. I left for work earlier. I stopped going to the same grocery store. I took a different route home. It felt ridiculous at first, like I was overreacting. But something in my gut told me this wasn't over. For the first time in my life, I accepted a hard truth. In my family, boundaries weren't seen as healthy. They were seen as threats. And once I stopped playing the role they needed me to play, they didn't want distance. They wanted compliance. Whatever came next, I knew one thing with certainty. They weren't trying to bring me back into the family. They were trying to pull me back into the position I had just escaped. Once the noise faded, a different kind of unease took its place. The calls had stopped. The messages had slowed to nothing. But my mind kept circling the same question I couldn't seem to put down. Why had they pushed so hard? Not just emotionally, but urgently. Not just Lauren, but my parents too. There was a desperation beneath the guilt trips that didn't match the story they were telling. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it didn't matter anymore. I hadn't signed anything. I was out. Whatever they were dealing with wasn't my problem. Still, the question lingered, tapping at the back of my thoughts during meetings, during dinner, during the quiet moments before sleep. The first crack came from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. I was at my desk when an unfamiliar name popped up in my inbox. The subject line was vague, almost apologetic. The message itself was short. The sender introduced himself as someone who had worked with my parents years ago, back when they were involved in a small family business I barely remembered. He said he wasn't sure if he should be reaching out, but he felt it was important that I be careful about signing anything connected to them. I read the email twice. Then a third time. He didn't accuse them of anything. He didn't offer details. He just said there were complications and that my name appearing on new paperwork could create problems I didn't deserve. He ended by saying he hoped I was well and that he understood if I chose not to respond. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Something cold settled in my chest as memories I'd dismissed for years began rearranging themselves. My parents had always been careful with money, or at least that's what I believed. But looking back, there had been moments that didn't quite fit. Conversations that ended when I entered the room. Documents tucked away quickly. Tension whenever finances came up, followed by reassurances that everything was under control. Lauren's lifestyle suddenly took on a different shape in my mind. The trips she never explained. The purchases she brushed off as gifts. The confidence she'd had when she pushed those loan papers toward me, like she already knew the system would bend for her. I did what I should have done weeks earlier. I spoke to someone who had no emotional stake in my family. Not to accuse, not to investigate, but to understand. I asked general questions about liability, about what co-signing really meant, about what happened when debts were tied to accounts or assets you didn't fully understand. The answers were sobering. I learned that signing my name could have made me responsible for far more than a single loan. That if money had been moved improperly, or obligations hidden, my clean credit and stable income would have made me an ideal buffer, a shield, a name that could absorb consequences while others stepped away. The realization made my hands shake. For the first time, I saw the pattern clearly. Lauren wasn't just dependent. She was insulated. And my parents weren't just protective. They were strategic. My stability hadn't been celebrated. It had been preserved for moments like this. Another message came a few days later. This one less cautious. The same sender warned that things were being reviewed. That questions were being asked. He didn't say by whom. But he didn't have to. The implication was enough. I thought back to my father's visit. To the way he'd framed the loan as character instead of risk. To my mother's insistence that this wasn't about money. It never was. It was about positioning. They hadn't wanted my help. They had wanted my name. The timing made sense now. The urgency, the escalation when I refused, the sudden shift from persuasion to intimidation. My number hadn't just disappointed them. It had disrupted something. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sick, angry, relieved in a way that left me hollow. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the city humming outside my window, and let the truth settle. I hadn't caused whatever was coming. I hadn't exposed anyone. I hadn't reported anything or made any calls. All I had done was step aside. And in doing so, I had avoided being pulled into a storm that had been gathering long before I ever noticed the clouds. I understood then why Lauren had sounded so certain when she warned me I would regret saying no. Why my parents had treated my refusal like a betrayal instead of a boundary. They hadn't been protecting Lauren. They had been protecting themselves. My phone buzzed once on the table beside me. A message from an unknown number. Just one sentence. We need to talk. Things are getting complicated. I didn't respond. I turned the phone face down and sat back, listening to my own breathing, feeling something unfamiliar but solid take root in my chest. Clarity. Whatever happened next was no longer something I could fix. And for the first time, I knew that wasn't a failure. It was protection. The first sign that something had shifted didn't come with sirens or accusations. It came quietly, folded into an ordinary Tuesday morning, disguised as routine. I was halfway through my commute when my phone buzzed with an email notification from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was neutral, almost polite. A request for clarification. A few questions. Nothing that sounded alarming on its own. By the time I reached my desk, my hands were already cold. The email explained that a review was underway involving financial accounts connected to my parents. It asked whether I had signed or agreed to any recent loans, guarantees, or obligations on their behalf. It emphasized that this was informational, not accusatory. Still, my heart pounded as I read it again and again. I replied with the truth. I had not signed anything. I had not agreed to anything. I had no involvement. The response came later that afternoon. Brief. Professional. Thanking me for the clarification. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Lauren called me that night for the first time in weeks. The sound of her voice startled me. Gone was the confidence, the sharp entitlement. She sounded rushed, breathless, like she was speaking while pacing. She asked how I was doing. The question felt foreign coming from her. Then she stumbled into talking about misunderstandings, about people overreacting, about how things were being taken out of context. She never said what those things were, but the tension in her voice said enough. She asked if I'd heard anything. I told her I hadn't. That part wasn't a lie. There was a pause, long and heavy. Then she asked if I was sure I hadn't signed anything. The question landed differently now, stripped of its earlier assumptions. It wasn't a demand. It was a check. I told her again that I hadn't. She exhaled sharply, like she'd been holding her breath for days. She said that was good. Very good. She said it was important that I stay uninvolved. She said things were sensitive right now, and it would help if we all stayed aligned. Aligned. The word made my stomach twist. My parents reached out the next day. Their tone had changed too. There was no anger, no disappointment, no lectures about duty. Instead, they sounded careful, measured. My mother asked how I was holding up. My father talked about how stressful things had become for everyone. They both emphasized the importance of family unity, of not making things worse than they already were. They didn't apologize. They didn't acknowledge the pressure they'd put on me. They spoke as if the past few weeks had been a misunderstanding we could all quietly step around. Then, my father said something that made everything crystal clear. He said it was probably best if I stayed out of things for now. He said it would be easier if I didn't get involved or answer questions from anyone. He said my distance could help smooth things over. In that moment, the entire dynamic flipped. They weren't calling because they needed my money anymore. They were calling because they needed my silence, my neutrality, my name untouched by whatever was unfolding around them. I told him I understood. I told him I wasn't involved and had no plans to be. My voice was calm, almost detached. He sounded relieved. After the call ended, I sat there staring at the blank screen of my phone, letting the realization settle. They had never needed my love. They had needed my credibility. Over the next week, information trickled in through channels I hadn't expected. A former colleague of my father's mentioned audits in passing. A mutual acquaintance hinted at accounts being reviewed. Transactions questioned. No one told me details directly. But the shape of the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Lauren tried again a few days later. This time with urgency she couldn't quite mask. She asked if I could just confirm something. Just once. To help clarify a timeline. She said it wouldn't take long and wouldn't involve signing anything. I said no. I didn't explain. I didn't justify. I simply said I couldn't help with that. Her voice cracked. Just slightly, she said I was being difficult at the worst possible time. She said family was supposed to protect each other. I told her I was protecting myself. That was the last time she called. The strangest part of it all was how little I felt the need to do anything. For so long, I had been conditioned to react, to fix, to step in before things fell apart. Now, with consequences finally moving on their own, my role was simply to stay where I was. And I did. I went to work. I met deadlines. I cooked dinner. I slept through the night. Each day that passed without another demand felt like a small miracle. One evening, as I was locking up my apartment, I realized something that made me stop in the hallway. Keys still in my hand. For the first time, they were afraid of me. Not because I was powerful, not because I had done anything wrong, but because I had refused to be useful in the way they needed. My absence had become a variable they couldn't control. I hadn't exposed them. I hadn't confronted them. I hadn't warned anyone. All I had done was say no and mean it. Whatever happened next would happen without my help. My money, or my name attached. And as that truth settled in, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Safety. The kind that comes not from being needed, but from being free. The silence stayed. Not the sharp, anxious silence that follows an argument, but a steady, uninterrupted quiet that stretched from one day into the next. No calls, no messages, no emergencies disguised as concern. At first, I waited for it to break, the way it always had before. Old habits don't disappear easily. But days passed, then weeks, and nothing came. That was when I realized how much of my life had been organized around anticipating other people's crises. Without the constant pull of my family, my days felt strangely open. I woke up without checking my phone. I drank my coffee slowly instead of standing at the counter, bracing for bad news. At work, I noticed how much easier it was to focus when my thoughts weren't divided between deadlines and guilt. I hadn't been tired before. I'd been on alert. The change didn't happen all at once. It was subtle, almost embarrassing in how ordinary it felt. I stopped jumping when my phone buzzed. I stopped rehearsing explanations in my head. I stopped feeling the urge to justify how I spent my money, my time, my energy. My job noticed before I did. One afternoon, my supervisor called me into her office. I expected edits or deadlines. Instead, she told me she'd seen a shift in my work. More confidence, more clarity. She said I seemed lighter, more decisive, like someone who trusted her own judgment. A few weeks later, I was offered a promotion, more responsibility, more pay, more say. The irony wasn't lost on me. In the one place where my reliability had always been valued, it was finally being rewarded instead of consumed. I celebrated quietly. Dinner with a friend. A good bottle of wine. No announcements. No permission needed. With distance came perspective. I began to see how carefully I'd curated my relationships outside my family, gravitating toward people who didn't demand constant reassurance or sacrifice. People who listened when I spoke. People who respected no as a complete sentence. For the first time, I noticed how often I'd been explaining myself before. Explaining why I couldn't do something. Explaining why I needed rest. Explaining why I deserved what I'd earned. I stopped doing that too. Information about my family still reached me, but it came filtered, softened by distance. A mutual acquaintance mentioned that my parents were dealing with serious financial consequences. Another said Lauren had taken a job she once would have scoffed at. The details were vague, and I didn't ask for more. I felt curiosity. I felt sadness. What I didn't feel was responsibility. There were moments when the old instinct flared up, sharp and familiar. A late night when I wondered if Lauren was okay. A holiday when I pictured my parents' empty table. Each time, the thought came with a reflexive urge to reach out, to smooth things over, to make it easier for everyone. I let the urge pass. Therapy helped me understand why it was so hard. My therapist put it plainly, without drama or blame. I had been the shock absorber. Whenever tension built, I was expected to absorb it so the rest of the family could remain comfortable. My value had been tied to my willingness to disappear under pressure. Naming it hurt. Letting go hurt more. One evening, months later, a message slipped through from a number I hadn't blocked. It was short. Careful. Lauren wrote that things were difficult. That she didn't know how to do all of this on her own. That she hoped someday we could talk. I stared at the screen for a long time. I believed her, at least partially. I believed she was struggling. I believed she was scared. What I no longer believed was that it was my job to fix it. I didn't reply. The sadness that followed wasn't sharp. It was dull, like an ache you learn to live around. It came and went. And each time it did, it left me a little stronger. I learned that grief doesn't always mean something is wrong. Sometimes it means something is over. I bought new furniture for my apartment. Nothing extravagant. Just pieces chosen without anyone else's opinion in mind. I painted one wall a color my mother would have hated. I liked it anyway. On weekends, I took long walks through neighborhoods I'd never explored before. I signed up for a class I'd always wanted to try and never made time for. My life grew outward, filling the space that had once been crowded with obligation. I thought often about who I had been trained to be. The reliable one. The fixer. The woman who made other people's discomfort disappear. That version of me wasn't evil or weak. She had done what she needed to survive. But she wasn't who I wanted to be anymore. One afternoon, as I was leaving the grocery store, I caught my reflection in the car window. I looked ordinary, calm, grounded, no visible signs of victory or loss. And yet, I felt something settle into place. I hadn't abandoned my family. I had exited a role that was slowly erasing me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the next problem to solve. I wasn't bracing for impact. I was simply living inside my own days, letting them belong to me. And that, I realized, was not cruelty. It was freedom. 2 years passed without any dramatic marker to announce them. No countdown. No final confrontation. Just time doing what it always does when you stop fighting it. My life didn't suddenly become perfect, but it became mine. Uninterrupted and steady in a way I once thought was impossible. I noticed it most in the mornings. I woke up without a knot in my stomach, without reaching for my phone to check for problems that weren't mine to solve anymore. My days moved forward instead of sideways. Work, friends, quiet evenings, small plans that stayed small because they were allowed to. I hadn't seen Lauren in a long time when it finally happened. I was standing in line at a grocery store on a Saturday afternoon, absent-mindedly comparing labels, when I felt it. That familiar awareness you get when someone who knows your history is suddenly near. I looked up, and there she was, a few feet away, holding a basket instead of a cart. She looked different, not ruined, not transformed, just ordinary, tired in a way that suggested effort instead of drama. She noticed me a second later. Our eyes met, and for a brief moment, everything we didn't say filled the space between us. She nodded. I nodded back. That was it. No apologies. No accusations. No attempt to rewrite the past. We stepped past each other and continued on with our lives like two people who understood that the conversation had already happened, just not out loud. As for my parents, I learned what I needed to know through distance. Consequences arrived quietly, carried by systems they couldn't charm or guilt into submission. The details didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that their choices belonged to them now, fully and finally. Lauren worked. Not a dream job. Not a passion project. Just work. The kind you show up for because bills exist and independence costs something. I heard she complained less these days. I heard she talked differently, more carefully. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt relief. People still asked me about it. Sometimes carefully. Sometimes bluntly. Friends, co-workers, even extended family members who had once lectured me about loyalty now asked if I regretted cutting them off so completely. I always answered the same way. I missed the family I thought I had. I missed the version of them that lived in my head, where love didn't come with strings and responsibility wasn't used as leverage. But I didn't miss the manipulation. I didn't miss the entitlement. I didn't miss waking up every day bracing for someone else's collapse. For a long time, I thought peace was something you earned by fixing enough problems, by being patient, by being understanding, by sacrificing quietly and hoping someone would notice. I was wrong about that too. Peace didn't arrive when my family changed. It arrived when I did, when I stopped arguing, When I stopped explaining, when I stopped offering myself up as the solution, I wasn't a backup plan anymore. I wasn't a financial bridge. I wasn't the shock absorber standing between chaos and comfort. I was just a woman living her own life, without apology. Some stories end with forgiveness. Some end with reconciliation and hugs and long conversations that make everything feel resolved. This one didn't. This one ended with distance, clarity, and something far more valuable than approval. It ended with peace. If you're listening to this and something in it feels familiar, if you've ever been the responsible one, the dependable one, the person everyone turns to because you always say yes, I want you to know you're not alone. And you're not cruel for wanting your life back. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can share them in the comments, or simply stay and listen to the next story. There are many of us out here, learning the same lesson at different points in our lives. And if you want to hear more real stories about family, boundaries, and what it actually looks like to choose yourself, you're always welcome here. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to forgive. It's to walk away and let peace speak for you. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.